right, let's jump right in. Today, we're diving deep, and I mean deep, into Indonesian communism in the 1920s and 30s, but with a twist.
A global twist.
Exactly. We're going international with this one, our main source.
A dissertation by Kankan.
Yeah, and let me tell you, this isn't your typical dry academic read.
Not at all. Kankan's work reveals how Indonesian communism was connected to movements all over the world. We're talking China, British Malaya, even the halls of power in the Soviet Union.
It's like a spy thriller with secret networks and revolutionary plots.
Absolutely. And it sheds light on a side of Indonesian communism that often gets overlooked.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Can you give us a quick overview of what was happening in Indonesia at that time?
Well, the 1920s and 30s were a period of intense anti-colonial sentiment. Indonesia, then known as the Dutch East Indies, was under Dutch rule.
Right, and that obviously caused a lot of resentment.
It did. There were various groups pushing for independence, and the Indonesian Communist Party, or PKI, was one of the most prominent.
And they weren't just some fringe group, were they?
No, not at all. The PKI had a significant following, especially among workers and peasants. They were very active in organizing labor unions and advocating for social justice.
So they were a real force to be reckoned with.
They were, and that's why the Dutch authorities were so concerned about them.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of anti-colonialism and a rising communist movement. Where do the global networks come in?
Well, that's where Kankan's research really shines. He shows how Indonesian communists were actively seeking connections and support from other communist movements around the world.
So they weren't just focused on their own struggle, they were looking to build solidarity with others.
Exactly. They believed that international cooperation was essential for achieving their goals.
Makes sense. There's strength in numbers, right?
Right. And they saw the Comintern, or Communist International, as a key ally.
Ah, the Comintern. For our listeners who might not be familiar, can you explain what that was?
Sure. The Comintern was this global organization founded in 1919 to promote world revolution. It was basically a network of communist parties from different countries.
So the Indonesian communists were hoping to get guidance and support from the Comintern.
Yes, and they weren't alone. Many anti-colonial movements saw the Comintern as a potential source of funding, training, and strategic advice.
But was the relationship always smooth sailing? I mean, were there ever any clashes of ideology or strategy?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the fascinating things that Kankan explores in his dissertation. He shows how the relationship between the PKI and the Comintern was often fraught with tension.
So it wasn't just a simple case of comrades unite.
Not at all. There were disagreements over tactics, priorities, and even the ultimate goal of the revolution.
It sounds like there was a lot of internal debate within the movement itself.
There was, and that's something we'll delve into deeper as we go along. But to really understand these global networks, we need to start with a key event, the uprisings of 1926 and 27.
All right, the uprisings. I've heard about them, but I'm not entirely clear on what sparked them.
Well, they were a culmination of various factors: growing economic hardship, anger at Dutch colonialism, and increasing support for the PKI.
So a real powder keg situation.
Yes, and the PKI, or at least some factions within the PKI, saw these uprisings as an opportunity to seize power.
Were they successful?
Not in the long run. The Dutch colonial authorities were able to crush the uprisings quite brutally.
That doesn't sound good.
It wasn't. There were widespread arrests, executions, and a crackdown on any perceived communist activity.
So the uprisings backfired.
In a way, yes. They led to a period of intense repression for the PKI.
I see. But even though the uprisings failed, it seems like they had a ripple effect that went far beyond Indonesia.
Absolutely, and that's what we're going to unpack now. The uprisings triggered a wave of international cooperation to suppress communist movements across Southeast Asia.
Hold on. International cooperation? You mean other colonial powers were getting involved?
Oh, yeah. The Dutch weren't going to face this alone. They reached out to their counterparts in British Malaya and even sought intelligence from the Americans.
Wow, so the uprisings basically set off alarm bells across the region.
They did. They created this sense of shared threat among colonial powers, leading to increased surveillance, information sharing, and even coordinated efforts to target specific individuals.
Like they were all ganging up on the communists.
In a way, yes. And one of the most surprising things that Kankan uncovered is that a British newspaper, the Singapore Free Press, actually predicted the uprisings a month before they happened.
Wait, seriously? The British press knew in advance.
Yep. Their analysis was spot on. They identified the rising tensions, the PKI's growing influence, and the potential for violence.
Like they had their finger on the pulse of what was happening.
They did. And this shows how closely the British were watching Indonesian communism. It wasn't just some distant concern for them.
It was right on their doorstep, essentially.
Exactly. And they were determined to learn from the Dutch experience and prevent similar uprisings in their own colonies.
Okay, so we've got the Dutch cracking down, the British on high alert, and this web of international cooperation to suppress communism. What about the Comintern? How do they react to all of this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The Comintern's response to the Indonesian uprisings was, well, let's just say it wasn't as enthusiastic as the PKI might have hoped.
Really? Why not? You'd think they'd be all in on supporting a communist revolution.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the reality is that the Comintern had its own agenda and priorities. And at that time, they were much more focused on events in China.
So the Indonesian communists were kind of left hanging.
In a way, yes. The Comintern's lukewarm support had a significant impact on the PKI, both internally and in terms of their global connections.
Oh, I bet. This is getting juicy. But we're out of time for today. We'll have to pick up the story next time and see how this all played out for the Indonesian communists. All right, so last time we left things on a bit of a cliffhanger.
With the Indonesian communists facing a serious setback after the uprisings, and, well, let's just say the Comintern wasn't exactly rushing to their aid.
Right, they had bigger fish to fry, apparently. But before we dive into the fallout from the uprisings and the Comintern's reaction, we need to talk about one key figure.
Tan Malaka.
Exactly. He's been lurking in the background of our story so far, but now he takes center stage.
He really does, and his story is like something out of a spy novel.
Seriously, it's wild. I mean, this guy was constantly on the move, evading authorities, traveling under aliases, always one step ahead.
He was, and it's a testament to his dedication, his cunning, and probably a bit of luck that he managed to stay alive as long as he did.
So last time we mentioned that he opposed the 1926 uprisings.
Right, he thought they were premature, a tactical blunder, and as it turned out, he was right.
But even though he disagreed with the strategy, he was still a committed communist.
Right, absolutely. And after the uprisings failed, he became even more determined to rebuild the movement.
Okay, but with the Dutch cracking down, how did he even manage to operate? I mean, wasn't he public enemy number one?
Pretty much. That's why he went underground. He went into exile, traveling to various parts of Southeast Asia, trying to rally, support, forge connections, and keep the revolutionary spirit alive.
So he's basically living the life of a fugitive.
He was. And Kankan's research is amazing because it pieces together Tan Malaka's movements during this time, drawing on police reports, intelligence records, even personal letters. It's like a detective story.
So where did he go?
Well, his first stop was Singapore.
Of course, the classic exile destination.
Right. It was a hub for anti-colonial activists and intellectuals, and Tan Malaka was hoping to connect with like-minded individuals there.
Did he? I mean, was he successful in building any network?
He did make some contacts, but his time in Singapore was short-lived. The British authorities were keeping a close eye on him, and they weren't too keen on having a known communist agitator in their midst.
I can imagine. So they kicked him out?
Essentially, yes. He had to move on, and his next destination was the Philippines.
The Philippines? That's interesting. I wouldn't have expected that.
It might seem surprising, but remember, this is all about global networks. Tan Malaka was looking for allies wherever he could find them, and he saw potential in the burgeoning Filipino nationalist movement.
So he was trying to build bridges between different anti-colonial struggles.
Exactly. And he wasn't just interested in Filipinos, he also had his sights set on connecting with communists in Burma and India.
Wow, ambitious. So he's like this one-man revolutionary network traveling the region, trying to spark a broader anti-colonial uprising.
That's a good way to put it. And he faced incredible risks along the way. Remember, this was a time of intense surveillance, and colonial authorities were constantly trying to track him down.
It's like a real-life game of cat and mouse.
It was. And in the Philippines, he actually got caught. He was arrested in Manila in 1927.
Uh-oh. So much for forging those global connections. What happened then?
Well, this is where things take another interesting turn. While he was detained, Tan Malaka actually received support from some unexpected quarters. Filipino nationalists, including prominent figures like Senator Manuel Quezon, came to his defense.
Wait, so they were defending a communist?
They were. They saw him as a fellow freedom fighter, someone who was struggling against colonial oppression. They put pressure on the government to uphold his right to seek asylum.
That's remarkable. It shows how anti-colonial solidarity could sometimes transcend ideological differences.
It does. It's a powerful example of how shared struggles can create unexpected alliances. Ultimately, though, Tan Malaka was deported from the Philippines. His revolutionary journey would have to continue elsewhere.
He just couldn't catch a break, could he? So where did he go next? Did he finally make it to Burma and India for those Comintern meetings?
Well, not quite. His path takes a rather dramatic detour, and we're going to pick up that story right after a quick break.
Okay, so last time we left Tan Malaka on the move again after being deported from the Philippines. Did he ever make it to those Comintern meetings in Burma and India?
Well, he tried, but the British weren't having it.
Yeah, they were keeping a pretty close eye on him, weren't they?
Oh, yeah. He was considered a serious threat. They saw him as this mastermind of communist agitation, someone who could stir up trouble across their colonies.
And to be fair, he kind of was, right?
Well, from their perspective, absolutely. And to them, preventing him from reaching Burma and India was a top priority.
So they stopped him in Hong Kong.
Exactly. They detained him there, effectively putting a stop to that leg of his journey.
I see. But even though he couldn't physically be there, his ideas were still circulating, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Tan Malaka was a prolific writer. He published numerous books and articles outlining his vision for revolution, his theories on strategy, even his critiques of the Comintern. And these writings were widely read, not just in Indonesia, but across Southeast Asia.
So even though he was physically constrained, his influence continued to spread.
It did, and that's why his story is so important. It shows how, even in the face of repression, ideas can still travel, networks can still be formed, and revolutionary movements can find ways to adapt and persist.
And it highlights the interconnectedness of these struggles, right? I mean, even though he couldn't make it to Burma and India, those movements were still part of a larger conversation, a shared fight against colonialism.
Exactly, and it wasn't just about physical presence. It was about the exchange of ideas, the inspiration that came from knowing that others were fighting the same fight, even if they were thousands of miles away.
Okay, so Tan Malaka is a key figure in this story, but we also need to remember that he was just one part of a much larger movement.
Right, the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI.
Mm.
And while he was in exile, the PKI continued to evolve, to debate strategy, and to try to navigate this increasingly hostile political environment.
We touched on this earlier, but can you remind us about some of the internal divisions within the PKI?
Sure. Remember, the PKI wasn't a monolithic entity. There were different factions, different approaches to achieving independence. Some favored a more radical revolutionary path, while others advocated for a more gradual approach, working within existing systems to bring about change.
And I imagine the failed uprisings of 1926 and 27 added fuel to those debates, right? I mean, there would have been a lot of soul-searching, a lot of finger-pointing.
Definitely. There were intense discussions about what went wrong, what lessons could be learned, and how to move forward. And these debates often got pretty heated, with accusations flying back and forth.
So it was a tumultuous time for the PKI.
It was. But it was also a time of incredible creativity and resilience. Despite the crackdown, the PKI continued to organize, to mobilize support, and to find ways to challenge Dutch colonialism. They established underground networks, used cultural events to spread their message, and even formed alliances with other anti-colonial groups.
So they were adapting, evolving, finding new ways to resist.
Exactly. And that's one of the key takeaways from Kankan's research. He shows how Indonesian communism wasn't just this static ideology, it was a dynamic movement, constantly responding to changing circumstances, constantly redefining itself in the face of challenges.
And it was a movement that was deeply intertwined with global networks of anti-colonialism and communist thought.
Right. The PKI was drawing inspiration from movements in China, the Soviet Union, even Latin America, and in turn, their experiences were shaping the broader conversation about revolution and social change.
It's fascinating how these seemingly distant events and ideas were actually so interconnected.
It is, and it's a reminder that history is rarely straightforward. It's full of surprising connections, unexpected alliances, and complex interactions that defy easy categorization.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, and I have to say, Shikankan's dissertation has given us a whole new perspective on Indonesian communism and its global networks.
I agree. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand this complex and often overlooked chapter of history.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring, to keep questioning the narratives you encounter, and to keep making those connections. After all, that's what history is all about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.